the first several years of being a father, I felt alone, but you don't have to. Us men, we're conditioned to go through things in solitude and figure it out ourselves. Well, unfortunately, this makes us feel like we're on an island all by ourselves with no one to turn to. If we as dads don't change our mindset and the narrative around going through things all by ourselves, then we're never gonna fully enjoy the fatherhood journey as we should. I'm Andrew Russell, founder of DadderUp, and I'm on a mission to promote and celebrate what it means to be a dad. I remember the first time I truly felt alone as a dad. Now, as in the case of my firstborn, when you have your kids and you're in the hospital, not only typically is your family there and all the nurses are there and you get a true sense of community, but also a sense of security and safety and anything that comes up, you have somebody there to help you. When you first go home, and typically you take your child in a car seat, plop them down in your living room, that's it. You're all by yourself. So I just remember at that moment feeling alone, having to figure it out myself, not really leaning into anybody or not having anyone to lean into for advice, and just kind of like going through the journey and feeling by myself. Now, during those first handful of years, would have been cool if there was something for me to defer to. So I checked and saw if there was any books, and most books are typically geared towards the mom side, nothing really for the father side, which is kind of disappointing. There's no apps, there's really nothing for me to lean into. So I went through the journey, was kind of figuring out, but definitely had a heightened sense of feeling by myself. So this feeling of being alone lasted for a handful of years. And throughout that journey, there was so much for the mom to lean into in terms of books and groups. And I was just going through it, head down, and kind of just figuring out myself with an extreme sense of being by myself. And then I realized throughout this process, I was really only yearning for three specific things. Three specific things were missing to make me feel not alone. And those things were validation, reassurance, and kind of redefining the sense of failure, that I wasn't failing. So I realized after discovering that I actually had a heightened need for these three things, that once I started leaning into them, to validation, to reassurance, to redefining what I perceived failure to be, that I started feeling less anxious and I started feeling like I was showing up as a better father. So the first thing I realized I was looking for was just the general human need for validation. Now, what's validation? Just really acknowledgement of the emotion. So specifically, I'll give you an example. If you run a business and you have kids, especially newborn, right? We're talking about bringing my newborn home from the hospital. Typically in the first, let's call it 3 months, what does the newborn not do? Sleep. What happens when an adult who's used to sleeping, 6, 8, 10 hours a night, starts not sleeping? Sleep deprivation, it's a thing. I still have the golf ball between my eyes from the sleep deprivation stuff. It never goes away. But it's difficult. But that's the human emotion where, you're running a business, as an example, if you're an entrepreneur, you're not sleeping. There's a lot of uncertainty, right? You bring in your newborn to doctor's appointments and they bring up certain things, they don't know what that means, and of course, Google something that if they say, hey, something could be wrong, which is really a 1 in a zillion, if you Google it, you're always gonna find something that's really crazy out there. All that stuff is very difficult for a parent, let alone a father, to go through. So at that moment, it would have been nice if I would have had validation. So I realized that is something that I need. So several years fast forward, when I had this realization, this is something that I was yearning for, or fiending in so many words, and I reached out to other dads or my business mentor or whomever, and I brought up, hey, this is something that I'm struggling with, or this is something that I'm feeling. I'm feeling that it is difficult. So fast forward some years, it's difficult running a business, being a solo parent at times, bringing them to all the sporting events, figuring all this out while also trying to do a health journey and go to the gym. This is difficult. And I've had great people in my life, in my recent years that have said, you know what, Andrew, that's accurate. I could empathize or understand that if you're running a business, if you're trying to be, as present as you can with your kids and not just have nannies and, run a successful business, but never really be around for your kids. What was the point of having kids? Hit the gym, do the diet, do all that stuff. It's very difficult. And at that moment, I realized when I heard that, it just felt so good emotionally to hear that what I was going through was valid and it made sense to somebody. And it's just, there's something about the genuine human need for validation that I realized at that point. By getting the validation that I was so yearning for so many years, I didn't feel alone. I felt like, oh, others understand what I'm going through, which was a big sense of calm. So the validation side is the real start of all this for me. And it's super important because when you realize what you're going through, that you're not on an island, you're not by yourself, and others are going through it as well, you get a true sense of calm and community. Now, the second item is reassurance. Now, validation kind of piggybacks into reassurance. But before we get into reassurance, If you're watching, you're probably a dad, or you probably know someone that's a dad. So you've heard of the DISC assessment. So we have the Flex 5 assessment. What it is there's 5 specific pillars of what it takes and things to focus on to be what I would call a real dad. It's presence, patience, strength, leadership, and legacy. So what you do is, if you go in the description, click the link, you take the free Flex 5 assessment, and based on how you score, you're gonna get a free workbook that's gonna help you on all of the weaknesses. So we found that dads that lean into this within 30 days see a lot of great results. So if you're a dad or you know a dad, hop in the description, click the link, take the free Flex 5 assessment and see where are there specific areas that I have to work on. You're gonna get the workbook right away and start working on them today. All right, so reassurance, which is the second thing. Just remember, validation is around the emotion, but reassurance is kind of fixing the emotion, fixing the distress. So as an example, reassurance as it relates to like a weight loss journey, for instance. So I feel like when I've been at my height of, being a chub, if you want to call it that my first 12 weeks, as I'm going through the process, going to the gym, doing the diets, I feel like I actually start to look worse before I look better. Again, I start to look worse before I look better. So, I've had coaches along the way or trainers, and they give me the reassurance like, no, the scale is going down. Your body type, for whatever reason, you hold, your fat in your stomach and you lose it in weird places. But I promise you, if you stay the path and you stay the course, that, soon enough you'll look great. And it just always seems to be that after 3 months, I start to look a lot better. So I realized as a dad, I was seeking that same reassurance. But if you're going through this journey all by yourself, then you don't have a coach, you don't have a mentor, you don't have anyone to lean into to tell you like, hey, I promise, keep doing what you're doing. Maybe your kid's still crying, right? The Ferber method, right? All these cool methods with kids and sleep and crying, and you just never know if what you're doing is right. How long are you going to breastfeed them and then go to a bottle? And there's just so many things. Wouldn't it be cool if you were able to lean into whether it's a mentor or a friend or a community of dads, and you would get that reassurance? Keep the course. You're doing a great job, Andrew. Things of that sort. And later in life, a handful of years back, I was able to find those to lean into, to say like, hey, what I'm doing with my kids, what I'm enrolling them for extracurriculars, how I'm dadding them, quote unquote. These are the things that I'm struggling with. These are the emotions I'm going through. To get that reassurance has really helped me not feel as alone. Another example would be specifically, there was a time when I was with my 2 daughters, and for whatever reason, the environment that we're in, there was a gentleman who's a lot older, and he was acting super inappropriate. He was cursing, he was doing all sorts of horrible things, gestures, and I felt very uncomfortable. So what I did was, I kind of, Papa Beared in front of my daughters. I shielded them, they were a little bit younger, and I got very loud with the individual. And it was very clear after a handful of minutes that I wasn't going to put up with what he was saying, how he was acting, etc. Now, unfortunately, the good and the bad is, nothing bad happened. He was eventually removed from the situation, and my kids don't even remember. But the bad was, I definitely was raising my voice. I definitely said things that was in an aggressive tone, and for little girls, it wasn't like the ideal situation of how I wanted to show up as a dad, but it was necessary. So at the time, I felt super alone. I didn't know if I made the right decisions. I didn't, to me, I put myself as almost like the protector of my kids at the moment. But I remember reaching out to one of my mentors, going over this with them, and he said, listen, he's like, number one, you did a great job. You have to put your kids first. And even in the moment, if you feel like you didn't do it the right way, like no matter what you did makes sense. You always want to keep them safe and remove, people that are in the environment that shouldn't be. I actually, funny enough, Andrew, I actually experienced something similar when I was your age. And it was at that moment where I realized that reassurance that I had been yearning for in the first several years, going through the journey, doing things, wondering if others experienced this, getting that reassurance from my mentor that he went through the same thing, it made me feel so much better. And at that moment, I realized that I wasn't alone, that there are other dads that have gone through this, and the sense of just belonging and alleviation of anxiety was amazing. So for reassurance specifically, this is definitely a human emotional need. This is a need where it's great to hear that once we kind of pull up for air as a dad and just kind of assess the situation, that others have been through this, that it's all going to work out, that what you're doing is great. And unfortunately, you can't do this alone. You need great mentors, you need good friends, good dad groups, good communities. But by finding those and really leaning into them and getting that reassurance, it alleviates so much anxiety. So the third thing that I realized I was yearning for was this whole concept around failure. And I had to really redefine what it meant to fail, or the true macro definition of failure as a father. So as many, if we've gone out there and we've spoken to so many dads and we say like, hey, listen, how was your, relationship with your dad? And over half of the dads that I've spoken with, at least myself, there's always some kind of a relationship flaw where they wish it would have been like this, or maybe the dad wasn't around, or whatever it is. So there's so many dads that have children that are victims of childhood, their own versions of childhood trauma. So if you are a victim of childhood trauma, you have a heightened sense of not wanting to fail with your own kids, right? I went through this growing up, so because of that, I'm gonna do a 180 and my kids are gonna experience this. No one tells us, dads, there are no books, there's no anything anywhere saying, guess what, dads, you are gonna fail so many times. But what does that mean to fail, right? If you miss the baseball game and you show up late, or you lost your patience a little bit because you had a bad day at work, or you were on your phone, in the case of myself, and you were not as attentive and your kids are starting to feel away, right? Or maybe you didn't lead by example that one day. That specific moment of failure does not define you as a dad. That was a huge thing for me to realize because I just felt I was so critical on myself. Now this kind of correlates to other aspects of your life. I'm sure if you're an entrepreneur, a business owner, depending on what you do for a living, you might be really hard on yourself as a human being, but that also could correlate to you as a dad. So I realized that failure is not that one specific instance of doing something not perfect. Failure is actually quitting on working on the things to make yourself a better father. What's the true definition of failure? So my understanding is the opposite of failure is success. So if I worked and flipped it on its head, what is success? What does that look like to me as it relates to being a real dad? So success to me is understanding that I will make mistakes, that it's progress, not perfection, that if I don't show up and I'm not patient, or I wasn't as present as I should be, or my diet wasn't the best and I'm gaining a couple lbs. So I realized I actually wasn't failing. The fact that I was so in tune with the things that I had to work on means that I was actually being successful. So more often than not, us dads, we're very hard on yourself. You have to really take a step back and realize that you're gonna make mistakes along the way. That's okay, just never give up. So once I redefined what failure truly is, when I started getting the reassurance that I was looking for, and then I started to feel validated, I no longer felt alone, and I felt like I was a part of the greater good of dads, or I was part of a shared journey with all dads collectively. Unfortunately though, besides feeling alone, dads also struggle with emotional expression. So make sure you watch our next video where we dive into dads struggling with emotional expression and ways for them to overcome it.